The morning the Duke of Grenthorpe rode into the village, every mother in the county forgot how to breathe. His carriage alone cost more than most estates. His name carried the kind of weight that made grown men straighten their backs without thinking. And his search for a bride? It had turned the entire season into a battlefield without a single sword being drawn. Lady Petronelle Vaux moved fast, faster than anyone expected. Within hours she had written the invitations, pressed her daughter's gowns, and quietly locked the door to her niece's room. Not locked it by accident. Locked it on purpose. Because young Anwen had a face that could ruin every plan her aunt had spent 3 years building, and Petronelle knew it. Now here is what I want you to think about before this story goes any further. If the one person most deserving of happiness is the one being hidden away, what does that say about the people doing the hiding? Because Anwen didn't stay behind that door. And the Duke? He noticed exactly what her aunt didn't want him to notice. This story is about to get complicated in the best way possible. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments, because this community is growing, and I want to know who is here. And if a hidden girl outwitting a scheming aunt in Regency, England, sounds like your kind of story, subscribe now, because part 1 begins immediately. The letter arrived before sunrise, not slipped under a door the way ordinary correspondence travelled through Vaux Manor. This one came tied to a stone and thrown through the kitchen window, wrapped in expensive cream paper, sealed with the Grenthorpe crest. The kitchen maid screamed. Cook dropped her ladle, and by the time the household stirred from sleep, Lady Petronelle Vaux was already standing in the hallway in her dressing robe, holding the broken seal in one hand and reading the letter with the other, her lips moving silently, her face cycling through 3 different emotions before settling on something cold and calculating. The Duke of Grenthorpe was coming. Not in a month. Not next week. He was coming in 4 days, and he intended to call on every notable household in the county as part of his formal bride selection. The letter, addressed generically to the families of the Denverley district, bore a postscript that made Petronelle's pulse quicken. It read, "The Duke requests informal gatherings rather than formal balls, as he wishes to observe family character in its natural setting." Natural setting. Petronelle read those 2 words 3 times. Then she folded the letter, tucked it inside her robe, and climbed the stairs with the quiet precision of a woman who had already decided what she was going to do before she had finished deciding it. Her daughters Flossie and Araminta were still asleep. They were good girls, in the way that ornamental vases were good. Pretty. Positioned correctly. Unlikely to say anything surprising. Petronelle woke them both with sharp knocks on their doors and told them to begin preparing immediately. New posture exercises, recitations of appropriate conversational topics, no giggling at meals. She did not knock on the door at the end of the hall. That door belonged to Anwen. Anwen Vaux was 18 years old, and the daughter of Petronelle's late husband's brother. When Anwen's parents died of fever 6 years ago, Petronelle had taken her in with the kind of public generosity that earned admiration at church and cost very little in genuine feeling. Anwen had grown up inside Vaux Manor the way a wildflower grows inside a stone wall. Technically sheltered. Quietly struggling. Never quite belonging to the structure around her. The problem, from Petronelle's perspective, was not that Anwen was difficult. The problem was that Anwen was extraordinary, and she did not even know it. She had her mother's cheekbones, her father's quick mind, and a quality that no amount of social instruction could manufacture. People looked at her and felt something. They leaned toward her in conversation without realizing they were doing it. She laughed at the right moments, and stayed quiet at the right moments, and there was a warmth in her that made every room she entered feel slightly more alive. Petronelle had noticed this years ago. She had noticed it the way a chess player notices a dangerous piece on the board, and she had responded accordingly. Anwen was kept from most social events. When visitors came, she was given tasks in the far end of the house. When invitations arrived, Petronelle simply didn't mention them. Anwen had grown so accustomed to this pattern that she had stopped questioning it. She filled her days reading in the library, helping the older household staff with quiet tasks they were too proud to ask for help with, and sitting at the window of her room, watching the county road with the particular expression of someone who has taught herself not to want things too loudly. On the morning the Grenthorpe letter arrived, Anwen was already awake. She had heard the kitchen window break. She had heard Cook's voice rise and fall. She had pressed her ear lightly against her bedroom door and caught fragments of her aunt's footsteps on the stairs, measured and deliberate. Something was happening. Something significant. She could feel it in the shift of the house's mood, the way country people feel rain before it falls. She dressed quietly and slipped out of her room before the household fully woke. The kitchen was in low chaos. Dishes had been rearranged by the maid's startled movement. A boy was sweeping broken glass from the window. Cook was standing at the table with both hands pressed flat on the wood, still rattling from the shock of her morning. She looked up when Anwen appeared and immediately softened. "Miss Anwen, you're up early. I heard the window. Is everything all right?" Cook glanced toward the door, checking for Petronelle, then leaned in slightly. "A letter came from the big house. Grenthorpe. The Duke is touring the district." Anwen kept her expression even. "When?" "4 days, they say. Your aunt's already planning." Anwen nodded slowly, poured herself a cup of tea that nobody had offered her, and sat at the far end of the kitchen table without being invited. Cook did not send her away. The kitchen staff never did. They adored Anwen in the quiet, practical way of people who know real kindness when they live beside it. She sat there thinking, while the house woke around her. 4 days. She had heard stories about the Duke of Grenthorpe. He had inherited the title at 19 after his father's sudden death. He had spent 3 years managing the Grenthorpe estates with a discipline that impressed even his harshest critics. He was 26 now, and the stories about him were contradictory in the way that stories about powerful people always are. Some said he was cold and exacting. Others said he was fair to a point that surprised people. One tenant farmer had told the blacksmith that the Duke had personally inspected drainage on flooded fields because he did not trust second-hand reports. Another story claimed he had ended a contract with a mill owner who mistreated workers at significant financial cost to himself. Anwen did not know which stories were true, but she found herself more curious about this man than she had been about anything in a long time, and that feeling alone told her she would be kept as far from his visit as possible. She was right. By mid-morning, Petronelle had assembled the household and delivered instructions with the brisk efficiency of a military commander who happened to smell of lavender water. Flossie and Araminta were to be prepared in every respect. Their wardrobes were reviewed, their conversation was rehearsed, the east drawing room was to be redecorated with fresh flowers and the better furniture arrangement. A menu of impressive but not ostentatious refreshments was to be planned. "And Anwen," Petronelle said, turning to her niece with the particular pleasantness she used when she was doing something she knew was wrong but had decided not to examine too closely. "You will be assisting Mrs. Thorne with the linen inventory that week. We have been putting it off too long." Mrs. Thorne was the housekeeper. The linen inventory took place in the basement storeroom. It was a task that generated no noise, no visibility, and no opportunity to encounter visiting dukes. Anwen looked at her aunt for a moment. Not with anger. With something quieter and more careful than anger. "Of course," she said. Petronelle moved on without lingering, which was how she preferred to deliver injustices. Quickly, and without eye contact. Flossie caught Anwen's eye from across the room and had the grace to look uncomfortable. Flossie was not cruel by nature. She was simply weak in the specific way of girls who had been raised to value their mother's approval above their own conscience. She said nothing, but she looked away quickly, which meant she understood exactly what was happening. Araminta did not look uncomfortable at all. Araminta was 17 and had already developed her mother's talent for not seeing what was inconvenient to see. Anwen spent the rest of the day being quietly, efficiently useful in ways nobody asked her to be. She helped rearrange the East drawing room when the footman could not quite get the proportions right. She suggested the better tablecloth without being asked, and then disappeared before anyone could thank her. She was good at disappearing. She had had years of practice. That night, she sat at her window for a long time, watching the road in the dark. She then blew out her candle and lay down in the dark, and the county road outside her window was empty and quiet, and the night held its breath the way nights sometimes do, before everything changes. The Duke of Grenthorpe arrived on a Thursday. His name was Caius Alderton, and he rode ahead of his own carriage. This was the first thing that surprised the district. Everyone had prepared for a formal procession, for footmen and outriders, and the full theatre of aristocratic arrival. What they got instead was a single rider on a dark horse, coming down the county road at a pace that suggested he had somewhere to be, and no particular interest in being watched getting there. He was not what people expected. The portraits that circulated showed a composed, angular face, and an expression that gave nothing away. In person, Caius Alderton was taller than the portrait suggested, and held himself with the kind of self-possession that does not need a room to go quiet before it commands attention. His face was exactly as the portraits showed, sharp-featured and still, but there was something in his eyes that the portraits had entirely missed. They were watchful in a way that was not cold, more like the eyes of someone who has learned the hard way that the obvious explanation is rarely the correct one. He arrived at Grenthorpe House by mid-morning and spent exactly 2 hours in private consultation with his estate steward before he began his social calls. His secretary, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Dobbit, had arranged the calls in careful order. The families of the district had been mapped by social weight, estate size, and marital eligibility. Vaux Manor sat at a respectable middle position on the list. Lady Petronelle Vaux was a widow of decent standing. Her daughters were noted as young and unmarried. The household was considered suitable for a courtesy call, if nothing more. Caius looked at the list once, handed it back, and said, "We will not follow this order." Mr. Dobbit blinked. "Your Grace. Arranged lists produce arranged behaviour. I want to observe how people actually live, not how they perform when they have had 2 weeks to prepare." He paused. "We will call on Vaux Manor this afternoon. They will not be expecting us for another day, at least." Mr. Dobbit wrote something down with the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised by anything. Vaux Manor was not ready. The fresh flowers for the East drawing room had not arrived. The better tablecloth was still being pressed. Flossie had a curl that had come loose from its pin, and Araminta had spotted something alarming on her chin that morning, and had been in a state of low-grade crisis about it ever since. Petronelle was in the middle of drilling her daughters on appropriate responses to questions about music and watercolours, when the footman appeared at the door of the sitting room with an expression that told her everything before he opened his mouth. "The Duke of Grenthorpe, my lady." At the gate. The sitting room went briefly silent in the way of a room where 3 people had all swallowed their panic at the same moment. Petronelle recovered first. She straightened, smoothed her skirt, and said with remarkable composure, "Show him to the East drawing room. Tell him we will be with him shortly. Do not let him wander." The footman disappeared. Petronelle turned to her daughters, and the warmth entirely left her voice. "Flossie," the curl. "Fix it now. Araminta, stop touching your face. It will only make it worse. Both of you, breathe slowly and remember everything we practiced." Then she turned and remembered Anwen. Anwen, who was supposed to be in the basement with Mrs. Thorne and the linen inventory. Anwen, who was obedient enough that Petronelle had stopped checking. Anwen, who at this exact moment was not in the basement at all. She was in the garden. She had gone out an hour earlier to cut herbs for Cook, which was the kind of task she did without being asked, and without telling anyone, because there was always something that needed doing, and she had long since stopped waiting for permission to do useful things. She was crouched near the kitchen garden wall with a small basket, her hair pinned, but not elaborately so, her hands soil-stained at the fingertips, entirely unaware that a duke was walking through the manor's front entrance. Caius Alderton did not stay in the east drawing-room. This was not deliberate misbehaviour. It was simply that Mr. Dobbit had been delayed at the gate speaking with the footman about the horses, and Caius had walked inside and found himself alone in a corridor that opened at one end onto a view of the garden. It was a good garden. Whoever tended it cared about it, which was immediately obvious from the way it was arranged. Not showy, but genuinely considered. He walked toward the garden door, which was standing open, and stepped out onto the stone path. He saw her before she saw him. She was kneeling near a low wall with a basket at her side, cutting something from the ground with the focused attention of someone who was not performing a task, but actually doing it. Her hair was slightly loose at the temples from the wind. There was a smudge of soil at the edge of her wrist. She was speaking quietly, which he found strange until he got closer and realized she was speaking to a very old cat that had arranged itself on the wall above her and was watching the herbs with elderly contempt. "I know you don't like the smell," she was saying, "but Cook needs it, and you are not the one cooking, so your opinion is noted and set aside." The cat blinked slowly. Caius stopped walking. He did not announce himself. He was aware that this was a social irregularity, but he could not quite bring himself to interrupt. He was also aware that he was looking at a young woman who had no idea she was being observed, which meant he was seeing something that careful social preparation could not manufacture. He was seeing an actual person. He had not seen many of those recently. She finally sensed she was not alone. She turned, looked up, and the expression that crossed her face was not the startled performance of someone caught doing something wrong. It was the genuine surprise of someone who had not expected company, followed almost immediately by a kind of frank assessment that he found entirely unexpected. She looked at him directly, not at his coat, not at the crest on his ring, not at any of the markers that usually preceded recognition. She looked at his face, and he had the strange sensation of being actually seen. "I'm sorry," she said, standing and brushing soil from her hands with a composure that was not trained, but simply natural. "I didn't hear anyone arrive. You must be looking for the house. This is the kitchen side." "I know," he said. "I walked here on purpose." She paused. "Then you must be lost in a different sense." He almost smiled. It was a near thing. "I am Caius Alderton." She absorbed this information with a stillness that was remarkable. Most people, upon realizing they were standing in a garden with the Duke of Grenthorpe, underwent some visible rearrangement of themselves. She did not. She simply said, "Then you're early," in a tone that was neither rude nor flustered, but simply accurate. "I am. Is that a problem?" "It depends on who you ask. For me, no." She tilted her head slightly. "For the people inside, probably quite significantly." He looked at her for a moment. "And who are you?" "No one of consequence," she said. "I help with the household." Before he could say another word, the door to the garden burst open and Petronelle appeared, Slightly breathless, her social smile fastened into place with the precise tension of someone who has just run up a corridor and doesn't want that fact acknowledged. Your Grace. Her voice was warmth and graciousness shaped into perfect sentences. Forgive us. We were not expecting you until tomorrow. What a delightful surprise. Please come inside. My daughters are so eager to make your acquaintance. She stepped forward and positioned herself, very deliberately, between Caius and Anwen, a movement so practiced it might have appeared accidental to anyone not paying close attention. Caius was paying close attention. He let himself be guided toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, and without fully turning, said over his shoulder, "The herbs you've cut. What are they for?" A short silence. Anwen answered from behind her aunt's shoulder. "Rosemary for the evening broth. Thyme for the bread." "The bread here is excellent," he said, as though this were a simple observation, and then he walked inside. Petronelle closed the garden door firmly behind her. She did not look at Anwen. Her instructions had already been delivered through the very act of closing that door. Go back to the basement. Stay invisible. Be nothing. Anwen stood in the garden alone, with her basket of herbs and the old cat still watching from the wall. She set the basket down for a moment and pressed one clean knuckle against her breastbone, pushing back against the feeling rising there. Not hope exactly. Something more cautious than hope. Something more dangerous. He had looked at her the way people do not usually look at her. She picked up her basket. She went to the kitchen. She gave Cook the herbs and washed her hands at the stone basin, and did not let herself think about his eyes, which were the color of deep river water in autumn, which noticed everything, which had looked at her like she was a person and not a shadow on someone else's wall. She did not let herself think about any of it. Inside the east drawing room, Caius sat in the best chair and drank tea that had been hastily but competently prepared, and listened to Flossie play a piece on the pianoforte that she had clearly practiced for exactly this type of occasion. Araminta spoke about watercolors with the focused determination of someone reciting from a list. Petronelle guided the conversation with the skill of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment in her imagination for longer than 4 days. He was polite, he was attentive, he asked the right questions and gave the right responses, and gave nothing of his actual thoughts away, which was something he had become very accomplished at over the years. But twice during the visit, without moving from his chair, his gaze moved to the window that faced the garden that was now empty except for the old cat, who had relocated from the wall to a sunny patch of stone and arranged itself there with an air of complete satisfaction. He stayed for exactly 40 minutes. He thanked Lady Petronelle with genuine courtesy. He told Flossie the pianoforte piece was well executed, which was true and diplomatically incomplete. He told Araminta her observations on landscape watercolor were interesting, which was a generous interpretation, but not entirely false. At the door, he paused and turned to Petronella. "The young woman in the garden. Is she a member of the household staff?" Petronelle's smile did not waver. Not a single muscle. "She is my niece, Your Grace. She helps with various domestic tasks. A quiet girl. Unremarkable." He held her gaze for exactly 1 breath longer than was comfortable. "I see." He left. Petronelle stood at the top of the manor steps and watched his horse until it disappeared around the bend in the county road. Then she turned and went inside with the controlled pace of someone who does not allow herself to feel afraid, but is beginning to wonder whether she should. In the kitchen, Anwen was chopping vegetables for the evening soup, and listening to Cook tell a story about a cat that had once stolen an entire sausage from a baronet's dinner table. She laughed at the right moment, the genuine kind of laugh that fills a room, and did not know that a few miles down the road, the Duke of Grenthorpe was riding in silence and thinking about a girl in a garden who had called him lost in a different sense, and had not once changed herself to suit his presence. Mr. Dobbit, riding beside him, asked if the visit had been useful. Caius said yes. He did not elaborate. But his secretary had worked with him long enough to recognize the particular quality of silence that meant something significant had just happened. He wrote a small note in his journal that evening. It said only, "Find out who she is." The morning after the Duke's visit, Petronelle was at her writing desk before the birds had finished their first round of noise. She wrote slowly and crossed out 2 lines before she found the words she wanted. She folded the finished letter herself, sealed it with plain wax instead of her household crest, and sent it out with the stable boy before breakfast reached the table. Nobody saw who it was addressed to. Nobody asked. In this house, questions directed at Petronelle had a way of answering themselves badly. Anwen came down to breakfast and found Flossie already seated, staring at her boiled egg with the expression of someone carrying something too heavy for her shoulders. Araminta arrived late and said nothing useful. Petronelle swept in last, poured her tea, looked at Anwen with the particular brightness she wore when a decision had already been made, and she wanted it to appear as though no decision existed at all. "Anwen, dear, I have been thinking." Anwen set down her bread. Those 4 words from her aunt's mouth had never once introduced good news. "Mrs. Thorne tells me the linen work will take longer than expected. I would like you to give it your full attention. All week, beginning this morning. All week," Anwen said. "You do it so well." Petronelle smiled and stirred her tea. "I would hate for you to be distracted by the comings and goings of the house." Anwen had never once said social occasions distracted her. Her aunt had been constructing that story on her behalf for years, building a version of Anwen that bore no resemblance to the actual person. A quiet girl, unremarkable, happiest when useful, content to remain unseen. A fiction maintained so consistently that the county had simply accepted it as fact. She looked at her aunt and felt something she did not usually permit herself. Not sadness. Something with more edge than sadness. Something that had been sitting at the bottom of her chest for 6 years and was, very quietly, beginning to stand. "Of course," she said. "Whatever you need." Petronelle moved on to Flossie's hair arrangements for the county assembly, which Anwen was not invited to attend, which nobody mentioned, because in this house the cruelest things were always the ones wrapped in silence. What Petronelle did not know was that Anwen had seen the stable boy leave before breakfast. She had been at her window in the early morning dark, and had watched him go with a letter tucked inside his coat, moving faster than any linen inventory required. She turned this over in her mind all morning, while she worked in the basement with Mrs. Thorne, counting sheets and recording figures in the ledger, and keeping her face perfectly composed, because composure had become her most practiced skill, and she was not ready to spend it yet. Her answer came from Griggs. He appeared in the storeroom doorway just after midday, ostensibly retrieving candlesticks, and stayed considerably longer than candlesticks required. His back was to the door. His voice was low enough to carry no further than the shelf beside him. "Your aunt sent a letter this morning," he said, "to a woman in the village, Mrs. Callford." Anwen's pen stopped. "Mrs. Callford is not a person of reliable character, Miss Anwen. She collects stories. Sells them to people who find them useful." He paused. "When she has no stories to sell, she manufactures them." The basement was very quiet. Somewhere above, the house moved with its ordinary afternoon sounds, none of which reached down here. Anwen sat in the silence and understood, with the clean clarity of cold water, exactly what her aunt was doing. Petronelle could not hide Anwen in a basement forever. The Duke had seen her. He had asked about her. He had, in the brief and inconvenient way of observant people, noticed her. So hiding was no longer sufficient. The plan had changed. Now Petronelle intended to make Anwen untouchable, not through force, but through reputation. By the time the Duke made further inquiry, a story would already be waiting for him. Something that would make a man of his standing step back without anyone needing to push him. Anwen set her pen down with a hand that did not shake. "Thank you, Griggs," she said. He nodded, collected his candlesticks, and left without ceremony, because he was old enough to know that the most useful thing you can do for a person is hand them the truth and clear the way. The story reached the village by Wednesday. It was not dramatic in the way of obvious fabrications. That was its sophistication. Mrs. Crawford did not tell people Anwen was dangerous or dishonest. She told them small, shapeless things, that the girl had a difficult temperament, that Lady Petronelle had always found her a private trial, despite her generosity in taking her in, that there had been an incident which Mrs. Crawford declined to name, because unnamed incidents are always more damaging than named ones, that the girl did not know her place and caused disruption simply by existing in the wrong spaces. By Thursday, the story had grown legs and was walking through the county on its own. By Thursday evening, it reached Grenthorpe House. It arrived sideways, through Lord Bastwick, a local landowner of middling importance who dined at Grenthorpe House that evening, and mentioned in passing, with the elaborate casualness of someone who has been waiting the entire meal to say something, that he understood the Duke had paid a call on Vaux Manor. "Decent household," Bastwick said, cutting his meat. "The widow runs things tightly. The daughters are respectable. There is a niece, I believe. Some difficulty there, from what I understand. A pity." Caius did not look up from his plate. "What kind of difficulty?" Bastwick shrugged in the manner of someone lighting a fire while walking away from it. "Nothing specific. Households talk. You know how these things are." Caius said yes, and moved the conversation to drainage rights, which occupied the remainder of dinner, and allowed Bastwick to feel he had delivered something useful. What Bastwick did not notice was that Caius had spent the rest of the evening saying very little and thinking a great deal. He had developed, through years of managing a large estate and the full range of human behavior that entailed, a reliable instinct for the difference between genuine accounts of character and manufactured ones. Genuine accounts had texture, specific detail. Manufactured ones had a hollow quality, like a room furnished to impress rather than to live in. What Bastwick had said about Anwen had no texture at all. After dinner, Caius sat in his study and looked at the note he had written 4 days earlier. Find out who she is. Dobbitt's report had come back that afternoon. Anwen Vaux, 18, orphaned at 12, taken in by her aunt. Regarded by the household staff with consistent warmth, which Dobbitt had noted as statistically unusual, since servants' candid opinions of household members were rarely flattering. The estate steward's cousin, who delivered supplies to Vaux Manor monthly, described her as the kind of person who learned your name and remembered it. There was no incident on record, no difficulty, no disruption of any kind. There was, however, a pattern. Absent from every social occasion, the manor had hosted across 4 years. Every assembly, every dinner, every call, present in the household and invisible to the county. Caius looked at this information for a long time. Then he did something that made Dobbitt, when he heard of it the next morning, press his lips together in the expression he used when preventing himself from making a professional comment. He sent a personal invitation to Vaux Manor. Not a general call. A specific invitation addressed to Miss Anwen Vaux alone, written in his own hand, for a small informal dinner at Grenthorpe House the following Saturday. 8 guests, entirely proper, entirely respectable, and entirely impossible for Petronelle to intercept without the whole household witnessing her do it, because Caius had taken the precaution of sending 2 copies by separate messengers. The letter arrived Friday morning. Petronelle read it in the hallway, with the door barely closed, and her face went very still in the way of someone who has played their strongest card and watched it fail. Her hands did not shake. They never did. But she held the letter one beat too long before setting it down, and Griggs, polishing a side table nearby with the practiced invisibility of long service, saw everything. Petronelle found Anwen in the basement before lunch. She came down the stairs with her expression rebuilt into something that resembled pleasantness from a distance, which was a considerable achievement given what she was feeling, and set the letter on the table beside the ledger with the deliberateness of someone placing something down that has cost them something to carry. "There has been an invitation," she said. "From Grenthorpe House. The Duke has invited you to a dinner this Saturday." Anwen looked at the letter, then at her aunt. "Me. You." Petronelle's voice was smooth and entirely unreadable. "I cannot imagine what prompted it. I will send a polite reply, declining on your behalf. I will say you are unwell and—" "No." The word came out quietly and without apology, and the basement went still around it. In 6 years, Anwen had never simply said no to her aunt's face. She had redirected. She had found gentle ways around things. She had worn the shape of compliance while quietly doing something else. She had never stood in a room and refused directly, because direct refusal requires a kind of solidity that takes time to build inside a person who has been consistently told she does not matter enough to have preferences. She had apparently been building it without realizing. Petronelle blinked. "I beg your pardon." Anwen stood from her stool and faced her aunt properly, the ledger forgotten entirely. "You will not decline on my behalf. I am not unwell. The invitation is addressed to me." Petronelle shifted into concern, which was the most dangerous form her expressions took. "Anwen, I am trying to protect you. You haven't had the preparation that Flossie and Araminta have had. The social expectations at Grenthorpe House are considerable, and I have spent 6 years running this household from the back rooms," Anwen said. "I know how to manage a dinner table. I know how to conduct myself in company. I have simply never been permitted to show it." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into water, and the ripples went outward and did not stop. Petronelle looked at her niece for 3 full seconds, and behind the concern and the pleasantness and all the practiced layers of her management, something moved that was older and rawer than any of it. The look of a woman who has made a decision years ago and avoided examining it too closely, because examination requires honesty, and honesty requires cost. She said quietly, "You will embarrass yourself." "That will be my own business," Anwen said. She left the basement with the letter in her hand and did not look back, and her footsteps on the stairs were even and unhurried, and Petronelle stood alone among the linens and said nothing and did not follow. Flossie found out at lunch. She sat very still when Petronelle mentioned flatly that Anwen had received a private invitation and accepted it. Araminta pushed her soup away. Flossie looked across the table at Anwen with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling on something that surprised Anwen, because underneath everything else, it looked like relief. After lunch, Flossie knocked on Anwen's door. She stood in the corridor with her hands pressed together and the look of someone who has been composing a sentence for too long and still does not fully trust it. "I know about the letter to Mrs. Crawford," she said. "The stories in the village." Anwen waited. "I did not help her, but I did not stop her either, and I have known for a long time that those two things are not as different as I have been pretending." She stopped. "I am sorry, Anwen. Genuinely." It came out without decoration, which made it worth more than a decorated version would have been. Anwen did not say it was all right, because it was not entirely all right, but she did not close the door either, which meant something. "Will you help me with Saturday?" Anwen asked. "I have nothing suitable, and I cannot ask your mother." Flossie straightened, as though something had clicked back into place inside her. "Yes," she said. "I will help you." Saturday arrived with the quality of a day that knows it matters. Grenthorpe House was larger than Anwen had imagined, and less frightening, which surprised her. It was the kind of house that had been genuinely lived in across generations. Not cold grandeur, but accumulated warmth, portraits that looked like they had stories rather than performances, fires lit because rooms were occupied rather than to impress, furniture bearing the comfortable marks of actual use. The other guests were already assembled when she arrived. Lord Bastwick was present, talking loudly, and fell briefly silent when Anwen was announced in a way that told her he recognized the name and was rapidly recalculating. Mrs. Stannock, a widow who collected botanical specimens and said exactly what she thought, found Anwen within 10 minutes, and declared after one exchange that she was sensible and interesting, and that she hoped to see considerably more of her. Dr. Petch told her she had the most level head of anyone under 30 he had spoken to in recent memory. The retired colonel's wife asked about the Vaux Manor garden with genuine curiosity, and listened to the answer properly. Caius crossed the room toward her when she arrived, and said simply, "You came," and she said, "I told you I would not be declined on my behalf," and something in his expression shifted in a way that was not quite a smile, but contained the same warmth. He did not treat her like a curiosity or a project. He included her in the room the way a person holds a door, without making a performance of the holding. Dinner was served in a room with long windows and honest candlelight, and Anwen sat 3 places to his left with a clear sightline, and twice during the meal she looked up and found him already watching. Not with cataloguing attention, but with the more complicated focus of someone encountering something they haven't seen before and are taking seriously. After dinner, during the music, he came and stood beside her near the window. "Lord Bastwick told me something about you last Thursday," he said quietly. She kept her eyes on the pianist. "I imagine he did." It matched nothing reported by anyone who had spent actual time near you. "And yet you invited me anyway," she said. "I invited you because of it. Manufactured stories have a particular quality. They are always slightly too smooth." He paused. "Genuine ones have edges." She was quiet for a moment. "My aunt is not a villain," she said, and meant it. "She is a woman who decided what she wanted and removed whatever stood between her and it. That is a very ordinary kind of wrong. That is a generous reading of someone who has treated you poorly. Generosity costs less than bitterness," she said, "and it takes less out of you over time." The music moved through the room. The candles shifted in a draught from somewhere and recovered. "Miss Vaux," he said, "I intend to call on Vaux Manor again next week, formally, and I intend to see you when I do." She understood the weight of that, not just socially, structurally. It meant her aunt could not arrange her absence without it being visible. The basement and the kitchen garden and the linen inventory would no longer serve as adequate distance between her and a man who had specifically named her. She also felt something she had not allowed herself in a long time. Not fragile hope. Something more like solid ground under feet that had been walking on uncertain surfaces for years. "You should know," she said carefully, "that my aunt has influence here. The stories about me are already moving through the county on their own." "I know," he said. "I also have a functional mind and the ability to distinguish a real account from a useful lie." A pause. "What I do not have is patience," for watching someone be quietly erased from their own life by another person's convenience. The music ended. The room shifted and gathered itself around the applause. At the door later, as guests collected themselves to leave, Mrs. Stannock told Anwen twice that she expected a visit, and meant it. Bastwick stood near the empty fireplace, recalibrating visibly. The Colonel's wife said she hoped to see her at the next morning call. Caius said good night to each guest in turn, and when it was Anwen's turn, he said simply, "Next week, Miss Vok," and she said, "Next week, Your Grace," and walked to the carriage with her back straight and her face calm. The carriage rolled into the dark countryside, and she sat in the interior and did not make the evening larger than it was. She was practical by nature. One dinner did not change a life. The road ahead still had her aunt in it, and gossip, and all the machinery of a world designed to keep women like her exactly where they had been placed. But she had walked into that house tonight on her own terms. She had spoken in her own voice and been heard by someone worth being heard by, and that was not nothing. She looked out the window at the dark road moving past and let herself, just for the length of the ride home, feel the full size of what that meant.
Petronelle did not sleep that Saturday night. She lay in the dark listening to the carriage return and to Anwen's footsteps crossing the entrance hall below, steady and unhurried. And something about that rhythm unsettled her more than any slammed door ever could. She had spent 6 years managing this household with the precision of someone who understood that control, once lost, rarely returned quietly. But the footsteps climbing those stairs did not sound like a girl who had been managed. They sounded like a girl who had decided something. She rose before sunrise and sat at her desk without lighting a candle. The letter to Mrs. Calford had failed. Bastwick had delivered the story exactly as expected, and the Duke had responded by sending Anwen a personal invitation in his own handwriting. That was not the behavior of a man who had received useful information and believed it. That was the behavior of a man who had received it, measured it against something he already knew, and found it hollow. She had underestimated him. More dangerously, she had underestimated Anwen. The girl who had spent 6 years saying of course had stood in the basement storeroom and said no with a steadiness that Petronelle recognized in her bones, because it had belonged to Anwen's mother first. Anwen's mother, who had walked into any room and drawn every eye without trying, without wanting it, which had always been the more infuriating quality. Wanting things could be used against a person. Not wanting them could not. She pulled out fresh paper. Then she put it away. Letters had not worked. Bastwick had not worked. She needed something different, something that worked through presence rather than distance, that reshaped the situation from inside it rather than attacking it from outside. She called for Araminta after breakfast. Araminta came in, read her mother's expression in 3 seconds, and sat without being asked. Between them existed the particular understanding of two people who have conducted a long, unspoken arrangement and know each other's language without needing to speak it aloud. "The Duke will call again," Petronelle said. "He will ask for Anwen." Araminta waited. "I want you to speak with young Mr. Gourley before that happens." Harlan Gourley was 23, son of a recently respectable merchant family, pleasant in manner, and had carried a quiet admiration for Anwen for 2 seasons without acting on it, largely because he was the kind of young man who waited for signals that nobody had ever sent him. "Tell him," Petronelle said carefully, "that Anwen has spoken warmly of him, that she finds his company agreeable." Araminta understood the mechanism immediately. If Gourley arrived at Vaux Manor showing visible interest, if he was present when the Duke called, the scene would suggest an existing attachment. A man of the Duke's position and principles would not pursue a girl who appeared already claimed. He would withdraw, honorably and completely. What neither of them knew was that Griggs had been in the corridor outside the sitting room for the past quarter hour, attending to a side table with the unhurried patience of a man who has learned that useful information travels best through people who appear to be doing something else entirely. He went directly to the kitchen. Anwen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she pressed both hands flat on the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment. and Cook arranged herself carefully at the far end of the room and said nothing, which was its own form of loyalty. Does Gourley know he is being used? Anwen asked. I cannot say with certainty. He has genuine feeling for you, as I understand it. Whether he knows the full purpose, I cannot tell. This was the part that made it complicated. Gourley was not an enemy. He was simply a young man about to be placed in a situation without his full understanding. Anwen did not want to humiliate him, but she could not allow the scene her aunt was constructing to play out in front of the Duke without it carrying a meaning it did not hold. She asked Griggs to arrange for a note to reach the Gourley house before morning. He said the blacksmith's boy passed their road on his evening round. She wrote to Gourley plainly. She told him a misrepresentation had been made about her feelings, that she did not wish him to find himself embarrassed by information that was not accurate, and that she held him in genuine friendly regard. She asked him simply to be honest about what he had or had not been told. She sealed it, gave it to Griggs, and returned to the kitchen without explaining further, because he already understood everything and explanation would only take time they did not have. The Duke came on Tuesday. He arrived at a correct but early hour, rode himself ahead of any carriage, and was received in the east drawing room by Petronelle, with Flossie and Araminta on either side of her, positioned with the practiced arrangement of people who have rehearsed a scene. Anwen was in the library, not the basement. The library, which connected to the drawing room through a closed but unlatched door, and she had gone there with a book and the calm deliberateness of someone who had decided that existing in her own house was not a radical act, but simply a fact. Petronelle saw her cross the hall as they descended and controlled her expression in under a second. She could not send Anwen away now without the Duke seeing it happen. The machinery of her plan had jammed against the reality of a girl who had stopped moving when pushed. Caius sat in the drawing room and was courteous and attentive and gave Araminta's conversational redirections the polite engagement of a man who sees exactly what is happening and has no interest in making that obvious. He drank his tea. He listened to Flossie describe the county assembly. Then he said pleasantly, I wonder if Miss Anwen is at home today. Petronelle sent the footman. He went to the library first because the staff always knew where Anwen was, and 2 minutes later, she entered the drawing room with the composure of someone who had been expecting this and had decided how to meet it. Caius directed questions to her throughout the visit, not in an obvious pattern, not in a way that invited easy interruption. He simply made space for her voice the way a person holds a door, steadily and without theater. Near the end of the visit, Petronelle excused herself to instruct the kitchen. Caius used the 5 minutes. Miss Vaux, he said, his voice conversational for the benefit of Flossie and Araminta, who had the grace to become interested in the window. I intend to speak formally at my next visit. I wanted you to know before that happens. Anwen looked at him directly. That is a significant thing to say. I am aware. My aunt will not agree easily. I know what her reasons are, he said. They are entirely her own and have nothing to do with yours. What I do not know is what your own feelings are, which is the only information that actually matters to me. The room was very quiet. Flossie had stopped pretending to look at anything else. Anwen held the question for a moment, not because she lacked an answer, but because she wanted to give it without dressing it in anything it was not. You are the first person in a very long time, she said quietly, who has asked me that. I intend to keep asking, he said. Petronelle returned. She read the atmosphere in the room the instant she stepped inside, precisely and completely, and something moved across her face that she replaced with pleasantness before anyone could name it. She sat and offered more tea, and the visit continued correctly for another 10 minutes before the Duke took his leave. At the door he said simply, Good day, Miss Vaux, in a tone that held considerably more than those 4 words. She said, Good day, Your Grace, and watched him ride down the manor road until the sound of hooves became silence. When she turned back, only Petronelle remained in the entrance hall. The pleasantness was gone. What was underneath it was something Anwen had never seen before on her aunt's face. Not anger, not calculation, something older, something that looked, with a start, like grief. You look like her, Petronelle said. Your mother. More every year. Anwen said nothing. She made everything look effortless. She walked into any room, and people turned toward her, and she never noticed or wanted it, which made it worse somehow. She stopped. I told myself keeping you back was practical, that it was protection. You told yourself a story, Anwen said gently. People do that when the true one is harder to carry. Petronelle looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked away toward the window and said nothing more. It was not an apology, but it was the first true thing Petronelle had offered in 6 years, and Anwen held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that has only just been placed in your hands.
3 weeks passed and the county noticed. Districts notice when a duke sends personal invitations twice to the same household and rides himself each time rather than arriving with the full theater of his position. People recalibrate. Mrs. Stannick called on Anwen at Vaux Manor twice with the cheerful directness of a woman who likes someone and sees no reason to disguise it. Dr. Petch sent a book about herbal cultivation with a note referencing their dinner conversation. The colonel's wife included Anwen in a morning call alongside 3 other women from the district, and nobody found it remarkable, which was its own statement about how quickly a reputation built on manufactured stories dissolves when reality keeps contradicting it. Harland Gorley wrote back to Anwen briefly and honestly. He confirmed what she had suspected, that he had been told something untrue and had believed it because he had wanted to. He thanked her for her honesty. She wrote back warmly. That thread ended cleanly without damage to either of them. Flosi had changed. Not dramatically. The quiet kind of change that happens when a person decides to stop looking away from things they have been avoiding. She joined Anwen in the library in the evenings and asked questions she had never asked before, and listened to the answers with the attention of someone discovering that the person beside them was considerably more interesting than they had allowed themselves to see. She stood up to Petronelle twice in small matters and did so politely and completely, and Petronelle accepted both corrections with less resistance than anyone expected. Araminta remained quieter than usual, which in her case was a significant adjustment, and occasionally appeared in doorways watching scenes she had previously tried to manage, with an expression that was simply young and unguarded, which was the most honest she had looked in years. On the morning the Duke was expected, Anwen came downstairs and found Petronelle alone at the breakfast table with a letter in her hand and her tea going cold. "It is from my solicitor," Petronelle said without being asked. "Your father held a small trust for you before he died. I was named administrator until your majority." She set the letter down. "You turned 18 in March." Anwen looked at the letter, then at her aunt. "I have been meaning to tell you for some months," Petronelle said. The silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people sitting in the honest wreckage of something that had never been built on truth, finally looking at it without looking away. "It is not a large amount," Petronelle continued, "but it is entirely yours. Enough for independence. Enough to act on your own choices, whatever they are." Anwen understood what it cost her aunt to say that word. Not financially. The other cost. The one that required admitting, without stating it directly, that choices had been withheld. That the trust was not the only thing that should have been handed over sooner. "Thank you," Anwen said. Petronelle nodded and looked toward the window. "He will be here this afternoon." "Yes." A pause. Then, quietly, "Your mother would have liked him. She had a way of finding the serious ones." "She found my father," Anwen said. "Yes," Petronelle said. "She did." They finished breakfast without speaking again, but the silence had changed. It was occupied now by something without a name yet, the beginning of something that was not forgiveness but was the ground from which forgiveness could eventually grow, if both of them chose to tend it. The Duke arrived at 2:30. Griggs showed him to the drawing room with the invisible satisfaction of a man who considers this a correct outcome and has been waiting for it patiently. Petronelle received him with Flosi and Araminta present, and within 10 minutes she excused herself, taking Araminta with her, and told Flosi quietly at the door to remain as was proper. It was the most honest thing Petronelle had done in 6 years as a chaperone. Flosi sat in the corner with needlework she made no pretense of working on, and the room held the Duke and Anwen and all the accumulated weight of the weeks between them. Caius sat across from her and spoke in the direct way she had come to understand was simply his nature. Not coldness, but the absence of unnecessary padding. "I have met a great many people," he said, "who present the version of themselves most likely to be useful or impressive in any given situation. I have grown extremely tired of it. It tells me nothing real." He paused. "You do not do that." "I never had the security to manage it," she said. "Performance requires a foundation. I was not given one." "That is one explanation," he said. "I believe the other one more. That it is simply not in your character." Flosi had set her needlework down entirely. Anwen. Her given name, spoken plainly, and they both registered it. "I am not a man who speaks before he is certain. I am certain about this. I am not asking anything today that you are not ready to give. But I am asking if you are willing. If you can see something real between us." She looked at him for a long moment and let herself stand fully inside the truth of what she felt, without shrinking it to a safer size. She thought about the basement and the linen ledger and 6 years of being kept in the margins of her own life. She thought about her parents, their faces growing less precise with each passing year, but their quality still present in her. Their steadiness, their warmth, their refusal to be made small. She thought about a garden and a disapproving cat and a pair of watchful eyes that had looked at her like she was worth the looking. "I am not a simple situation," she said. "I do not want a simple one," he said. "I want an honest one." She exhaled slowly. "Then yes, I am willing." Flosi made a sound that was unconvincingly converted into a cough. Caius looked at Anwen with the expression that had been working its way toward completion since the garden and finally arrived, fully and without reservation, and it changed his face into something warm and unguarded that the county had not yet seen. Petronelle appeared in the doorway with the timing of a woman who had been in the adjacent room. She looked at the Duke, then at Anwen, then at the shape of what the room contained, which was the beginning of something that could not be undone. She stepped inside and addressed Caius with a formality that was not cold but precise, the formality of someone making a deliberate choice about how to move forward. "Your Grace," she said, "there are proper things to discuss, the way they ought to be done." "There are," he agreed. "I am prepared." Petronelle sat down with the careful dignity of a woman rearranging herself around a new reality. The conversation that followed was formal and correct, and contained within it the unspoken acknowledgement on all sides that the years behind them had been what they had been and the years ahead would be something entirely different. When the Duke left, he paused at the door and looked back at Anwen, and the look between them was brief and direct and carried everything built across these weeks, compressed into a moment that needed no duration to hold its full weight. That evening, Anwen sat in the library with Flosi beside her and the fire burning small and steady and the county road dark and quiet outside the window. "Are you frightened?" Flosi asked. Anwen considered it honestly. "A little," she said, "but not of the wrong things anymore." Flosi nodded as though this made complete sense, and perhaps it did, because she was becoming someone who understood the difference between the fears worth carrying and the ones worth setting down. Petronelle stayed in her room that evening with her light burning long after the house went quiet, and whatever she was working through in there, she did it privately and fully, which was perhaps the beginning of something honest in her as well. Griggs passed through the entrance hall one final time before bed, paused at the foot of the stairs, and looked up at the landing with the expression of a man who has watched a household for decades and knows the difference between a night that closes something and a night that opens it. This was the second kind. Anwen sat at her library window and felt the specific quality of a life that has turned. Not perfectly, not without cost, but truly toward something better. The girl who had been kept from the room had walked through the door entirely on her own terms. The Duke had not rescued her. Honesty had, steadiness had, the refusal to be erased had, and no one in this story had written her ending for her. She had written it herself, quietly and without permission, one honest word at a time.